The wind was cold and dry across the strange green forest on the edge of the human outpost, and the leaves made a soft rustling sound as if they were whispering secrets to one another. And deep in the heart of this forest, a small figure moved quietly through the thick bush with trembling hands and wide scared eyes, her fur-covered body barely making a sound. Her name was Lyra, and she was not human, and she belonged to a peaceful herbivore, alien race that lived in hidden villages far from human cities, and ever since she was little her elders told her that humans were monsters who hunted and ate others with sharp teeth and cold hearts, and that they built traps in the wild to catch anything that moved. She did not want to believe it, but now her feet were stuck and her legs were bleeding and her tiny arms were shaking because she had stepped on something hidden under the leaves, and now she was caught inside a human trap with a heavy net pulled tight around her and a strange blue light blinking above her head. She tried to scream, but her voice came out as a soft cry, and her heart beat so fast she thought it might explode, and the trees above her danced in the fading sunlight, while strange birds flew away from the noise. And then she heard footsteps, not her own and not from any animal. Crunch, crunch, slow, careful, heavy. Someone was coming, and her ears twitched and her eyes filled with tears, because she knew it was a human, and he would see her and he would eat her, just like the old stories warned. Then he appeared, tall and strange and covered in something hard and black, his face hidden under a helmet with a glowing screen and strange tools on his belt, and he stood silently for a moment, watching her from a distance like a hunter, and she froze and held her breath and waited for the pain to begin. But the human did not pull out a weapon. Instead, he walked closer, slowly, like he did not want to scare her, and then he said something, but she did not understand his words, and his voice was soft, not angry, not cruel, just calm. He knelt beside the trap and touched the net and then looked at her eyes, and she flinched, but he said something again, and this time it felt like he was trying to help and not harm. And she looked at his hands, and they were not holding anything sharp, and then he pulled out a small tool and started cutting the net. She wanted to run, but her legs were still stuck and she could not move, and the human kept working, and the net grew loose, and then with one final pull he set her free and stepped back as if to give her space. She did not move. She sat there looking at him with fear and confusion, and her thoughts ran wild. Maybe he was playing, maybe he wanted her to feel safe before he took her to others, maybe he would follow her home and hurt her family. But then he did something strange. He pulled off his helmet and placed it on the ground, and now she could see his face, and he looked young and tired, and his eyes were not cold. They were sad, like someone who had lost something. And he opened a small pack and took out something round and red and soft and rolled it toward her food. She looked at it and then at him, and he nodded slowly. She sniffed the fruit, and her stomach growled and her eyes blinked fast, and she took a bite, and it was sweet and not poisoned, and the human smiled a little, like he was happy, and then sat down far from her, facing the tree. Silence grew between them, and the birds started to return, and the sun dipped lower behind the hills, and her heart calmed a little, but her mind was still filled with questions. Why did he help her? Why did he not capture her? Why did he give her food? Was this a trick? Was he really alone? She stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and looked at the human again, and he was drawing something on the dirt with a stick, and when he saw her standing, he smiled again and drew a flower and a sun and then a star, and she tilted her head, confused but curious. Maybe he was trying to speak without words. Maybe he was not like the monsters her elders feared. Maybe she was wrong, but fear still lived in her heart. She took one small step closer, then stopped. He reached for something, and she jumped back, but it was only a soft cloth, and he threw it gently toward her, maybe to cover her wounds, and the cloth smelled clean, and she touched it, and then looked at the trees and back at him. She could run now, but something held her here, something strange and new, and then a distant sound echoed through the forest, a sharp mechanical noise like engines, and she saw the human look toward the sky with worry in his eyes, and he stood up quickly and said something louder this time, and pointed toward the bush as if asking her to hide. Fear returned fast and strong, but she stayed frozen because something was coming, something worse than him, something that made even the human afraid, and her breath caught in her throat as shadows moved beyond the trees. The sound came again, louder now, like heavy wings or machines grinding through the wind and the ground. shook a little with each passing second as if something massive was drawing near, and the trees around the small clearing bent, ever so slightly as if they too were afraid, and Lyra stared at the human who now stood still, his back straight, his hands clenched, and his eyes scanning the sky. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. Her mind told her to escape into the trees, yet her body remained rooted in the dirt, with the cloth in her hands and her eyes wide with fear, as the human took slow steps toward her with one hand raised not in anger, but in urgency, pointed toward a group of bush not far behind her, and waved again, making a sweeping motion as if trying to tell her to go there now before it was too late. And she blinked and trembled, but still did not understand who was coming or what danger made even this human so tense and so silent. Suddenly the sky cracked open with a beam of red light slicing through the trees and burning the edge of a branch nearby, and the smell of smoke filled the air, and birds flew away screaming, and the human jumped forward, grabbing Lyra by the arm, not roughly but with firm purpose, and led her quickly toward the bush he had pointed at before. They crouched low together behind the thick leaves, and she could hear the rapid thudding of machines, or maybe footsteps, not from any living thing but from something built and heavy and without a heart. And then came a voice from above, mechanical and loud, speaking in a strange, sharp language that echoed across the floor. The human leaned closer and whispered something very softly, a word or two that she could not fully grasp, but his tone was clear. He was warning her to stay quiet, to stay low, to breathe slowly, and she obeyed because the fear inside her had grown even stronger, and now it wrapped around her like a second skin. Through the tiny gap in the leaves she saw Ida, giant flying machine, black and silver with red symbols glowing on its sides, hovering just above the treetops and dropping long metal legs into the ground, and from its side jumped two tall figures wearing armor brighter than the sun, their weapons glowing and their helmets scanning every inch of the forest. Lyra gasped, but covered her mouth and turned toward the human, who was watching with narrowed eyes and tense shoulders, and his jaw set as if he had seen this before, as if he knew exactly what these creatures were and what they wanted. They were not like him. They were hunting something, maybe her, maybe him, maybe both. One of the armored figures knelt and touched the broken net where she had been trapped moments ago, and a red light appeared in his hand, showing the image of her tangled in the ropes, and then the image of the human setting her free, and the second armored figure growled and raised his weapon. The human beside her took out a small device from his belt and pressed it twice, then held it close to his mouth and whispered something again in the strange language of his people, and Lyra watched him with wide eyes, not knowing if he had called for help or invited more danger. The armored figures began to spread out, scanning the ground, following the light trails left by their boots and the heat of her footsteps, and one of them moved dangerously close to the bush where they hid her. Breath caught in her throat, and she closed her eyes, hoping that she would disappear or that this was a dream. And then she felt the human shift beside her, his body ready to move, ready to strike, ready to protect. The armored figure paused just before the bush and leaned forward, and Lyra felt her heart scream in silence, and then a loud crack echoed through the forest as a large tree in the distance exploded and fire rained down, and both armored soldiers turned sharply toward the sound and ran in that direction with their weapons high. The human lowered his hand, and the small device blinked once in his grip. He had triggered the explosion. A diversion. Lyra looked at him, and for the first time she saw not just fear or mystery, but something else, something deeper, a will to protect, not just himself, but her too. A stranger, a creature he had only just met. He signaled with his hand again, urging her to follow him as they crept through the underbrush, moving quietly away from the clearing and deeper into the forest, where the light could not reach and the air grew thicker with shadows. Every step was careful, every breath was quiet, and every heartbeat felt like thunder in her ears as the two of them slipped through the vines and the roots and the rocks into a hidden cave beneath an ancient tree. Inside, it was dark but dry, and the walls glowed faintly with green moss, and the air was warm and still, and Lyra sank to the ground, her legs finally giving out as the adrenaline faded and her body ached from fear and confusion. The human stood at the entrance, listening for sounds from the forest above, and when none came, he turned back to her and spoke gently, slowly, pointing at himself and saying a word, Kai. His name was Kai. She blinked and looked at him and then pointed at herself and whispered her name, Lyra. He smiled just a little, then opened his pack and gave her more food. This time berries and water and a piece of cloth for her wounds, and she took them with shaking hands and sat in silence watching him as he sat across the small cave and lit a soft blue light. For the first time since she was captured, she felt safe, but the fear was not gone because she now knew this was not the end, it was only the beginning. The night grew colder as shadows stretched across the forest and the stars blinked silently above the trees while inside the cave. Lyra sat with her knees hugged to her chest, her eyes fixed on the human named Kai, who was now leaning against the rock wall, his face half lit by the blue light resting between them. She wanted to sleep, but her mind was spinning with questions and her body remained tense from fear, and her heart would not let her rest because she still did not know who those armored creatures were, or why they came after her, or why this human had risked himself to protect her. Kai opened his bag slowly and pulled out something wrapped in dark cloth and then unrolled it, revealing a thin metallic sheet with glowing lines etched across its surface, and as he tapped a small circle near the top, the map came to life, showing a strange web of lights and paths floating in midair above the sheet. Lyra leaned closer, her curiosity stronger than her fear, and she pointed at a small blinking dot near the bottom of the map and looked at him with wide questioning eyes, and he nodded slowly, then pointed to a red X far to the north. He tapped his chest, then pointed at the red X, then pointed at her and then back at the dot. She did not understand everything, but she felt the message inside his gestures. He wanted to take her somewhere far away, to a place where maybe the danger would not reach them, where the machines in the sky could not follow, where the hunters would not look. Lyra traced the glowing path with her fingers, watching the tiny lines twist and bend like rivers, and when she touched the red X, the map blinked and showed a glowing sun above the mark and a small green tree beside it, and her heart fluttered. Maybe it was a safe zone, or maybe a signal station, or maybe a place where others like him or her waited for help. Kai tapped the map again and the image disappeared, and then he tucked it back into his cloth and placed it inside the bag as if it were the most precious thing in the world, and then he leaned his head back and closed his eyes for just a moment. She watched him closely and then looked at her own hands, dirty and scratched, and remembered the way he had pulled her from the trap without asking for anything, and how he had shielded her from the flying machines and even hurt himself while diving into the bush. He could have left her, but he did. Note a sudden sound outside the cave made them both jump, and Kai stood up quickly, his eyes sharp again as he moved to the cave entrance and listened with one hand on a strange black device on his hip, and Lyra followed him quietly, holding her breath through the leaves. They saw fire, not wild, but placed in circles glowing with blue flames, and tall shadowy figures walking between them, chanting something in a low rumble that made the earth vibrate. These were not armored hunters. They were something else, alien shapes with long limbs and faces hidden behind hoods, carrying staffs that pulsed with red light, and around them were markings carved into the ground glowing with symbols. Neither Kai nor Lyra could understand one of the figures held up a crystal, and the fire grew taller and twisted into a shape that looked like a beast, with wings and fangs and eyes like burning coals, and the chanting grew louder, and Lyra's ears hurt and her skin felt cold and her breath shallow. Kai pulled her back gently and whispered something soft, his voice calm but urgent, and he motioned toward a smaller path leading away from the cave. They had to move. He picked up his pack and motioned for her to stay close, and together they slipped into the underbrush, moving carefully, with every step silent and slow, and the ground beneath them covered with moss and old roots that twisted like sleeping snakes. They walked for what felt like hours until the glow of the fires faded and the forest grew dark again, and then finally they reached a small cliff overlooking a wide valley filled with fog and silence. Kai sat down on a flat rock and took out a metal tube from his belt and twisted it open, releasing a soft green light into the air, and Lyra watched as the light floated upward like a signal, or maybe a message he was calling someone. She wondered if they would come. Minutes passed and nothing happened, but then a small light blinked in the far sky and grew brighter, and then split into two, and then three, and soon a soft hum filled the air like a song from the stars. A small round drone flew down from the clouds and hovered in front of Kai, who held out his arm and let it scan his wrist. Then it turned to Lyra and scanned her as well, and then blinked yellow and turned away. Kai's face changed for a moment, a flicker of sadness or doubt or maybe worry, and he tapped the drone twice and it flew upward. Disappearing into the night, he looked at Lyra and shook his head. Slowly, then tapped the map again and pointed to a new path, one longer and harder and filled with strange symbols she had never seen before. The drone would not help. They were on their own. Lyra felt her chest tighten, but she nodded and took a deep breath and followed him, as he stood and began walking again into the fog where no fire burned and no voice chanted, and the only sound was the soft whisper of the wind. She did not know what waited at the end of this journey, but she knew one thing: she would not face it alone. The path grew narrow as Kai and Lyra climbed higher into the mountain that loomed like a sleeping beast over the foggy valley, and each step felt heavier than the last as cold wind pressed against their faces and strange sounds echoed through the cracks in the stone walls around them like whispers carried from the past. The trees were gone now, and only bare rock and ice remained, and the sun had vanished behind thick clouds that moved too fast to be natural, and Lyra felt the weight of the air change, as if the mountain itself were watching them and listening to every breath they took. Kai walked ahead, steady and quiet, his eyes scanning the edges of the cliffs and the ridges above and below, while his hand never left the strange device on his belt, and Lyra followed close behind, trying to match his steps and control the fear that crawled up her spine like frost. Suddenly, the wind stopped and the air went still, so still that even the sound of their boots on the ground vanished, and Lyra froze and looked around with wide eyes, and Kai raised one hand, signaling her to stay still. Something was here, something old and hidden. From a gap in the stone wall beside them, a soft blue light pulsed once, then faded, then pulsed again, as if calling them forward, and Kai stepped closer and placed his palm on the stone, and the wall responded by shifting inward, revealing a narrow doorway carved into the heart of the mountain. He looked back at Lyra, and she nodded even though her legs trembled, and together they stepped into the dark corridor where the light dimmed and a strange hum filled the air like the distant echo of a forgotten song inside the mountain. The walls were smooth and lined with veins of glowing crystal that pulsed in rhythm with their footsteps, and the floor was warm, unlike the cold rocks outside, and the deeper they went, the more the air felt heavy with memory and silence. Then the corridor opened into a massive chamber with walls that stretched so high they vanished into darkness, and in the center stood a circular platform surrounded by floating stones, each engraved with symbols Lyra had never seen before. Kai approached the platform and touched one of the stones, and suddenly the chamber lit up with images of stars and planets and strange ships flying through space, and Lyra gasped as one of the planets shone, looked just like hers, and a red mark appeared over it, flashing slowly like a warning. The images changed and now showed battles and machines and creatures in armor destroying forests and cities and villages, and Lyra stepped back, her heart racing as she recognized the same machines that had chased her in the forest. This place was showing the past and the future, and then the light focused on a single figure, a girl with fur like Lyra standing beside a human like Kai, and they were holding something between them, a glowing stone that pulsed with green light and sent waves across the map. Lyra pointed at the image and then at herself, then at Kai, and his eyes widened as he nodded slowly and stepped back from the platform as if realizing something important. They were connected not just by chance but by something much older. The mountain whispered her name, not in sound but in feeling, and she turned toward one of the walls where a small panel opened, revealing a crystal embedded in the rock, glowing with the same green light as the one in the vision. She reached out to touch it, and as her fingers brushed the surface, the chamber shook and the stones above began to spin faster and faster, and the air filled with energy, like a storm gathering in silent sky, pulled her back as a beam of light shot from the crystal into the platform, and a voice echoed through the chamber, speaking in a language neither of them knew, but somehow Lyra understood every word. The protector awakens. The balance must be restored. The journey has begun. Then the light vanished and the stones fell still, and the chamber grew quiet again as if nothing had happened. Kai looked at her with a mix of awe and fear, and she looked back with the same, because now they both knew they were not just running, they were chosen. Outside the chamber, the mountain groaned as if something deep beneath The earth had started to move and cracks appeared along the ceiling in dust. Rain Down Kai grabbed her hand and they ran back through the corridor. As the walls shook and the doorway behind them began to close and they just barely made it through before the stone sealed shut with a final sound like thunder, they stood outside panting and shaking, and the sky above them had turned dark with green clouds swirling over the peaks and a strange light flickering in the distance. Lyra looked at the crystal now glowing faintly in her palm and felt warmth spreading through her chest. Not fear, but strength. Kai placed his hand gently on her shoulder, and then pointed toward the highest mountain ahead where the clouds circled like a crown and where their path would lead. Next, no more hiding, no more running. The war was coming and they would be ready because they had each other, because they had the light, because the mountain had chosen them. The wind howled louder as Kai and Lyra moved along the narrow ridge that curved like a blade across the side of the tallest mountain, and the ground beneath them felt sharp and loose with small rocks falling into the foggy abyss below. With every careful step they took forward, Lyra wrapped her arms tighter around her body as the cold bit through her fur, and her eyes watered from the icy air that carried strange voices like echoes from long ago. And above them, the green clouds swirled faster as if the sky was watching and waiting for something to rise. Kai walked ahead, steady and alert, his body tense like a coiled wire, and every few steps he paused to check a small round device on his wrist, which blinked softly with orange light pointing toward the peak that now loomed like a jagged crown above the clouds. Neither of them spoke, and yet everything around them spoke louder than words. The mountain groaned beneath their feet. The wind sang a song of warning, and far below a low rumble echoed like the breath of something ancient stirring in the darkness. Reached a stone arch that stood alone like a forgotten gate, and carved across the top in glowing silver letters were strange symbols that shifted shape when looked at directly, and though Lyra could not read them, she felt them deep in her chest like a heartbeat out of time. Kai touched the stone, and the air around them shimmered as the path ahead changed from broken rock to a glowing bridge of light that extended across a massive chasm too wide to see the other side, and the light pulsed gently like it was alive. Lyra hesitated, her legs shaking as she looked down at the swirling fog below, and Kai reached out his hand and waited with calm eyes, and she slowly placed her hand in his, and together they stepped onto the light path which held them like solid ground, though nothing touched the earth beneath. Each step felt strange, like walking on frozen fire, and the further they walked, the more the light changed color from blue to violet to gold, and ahead they saw a platform floating in the air with a tall pillar at its center, and around it were statues shaped like beings neither human nor alien, but something in between. They reached the platform, and the pillar came to life, glowing with red light that spread across the sky, forming symbols and shapes, and from those symbols emerged a voice that filled their minds not with sound but with thought. The voice spoke of balance broken, of worlds stolen and stars burned, of a guardian lost and a seed that must be protected. And Lyra saw images in her mind of ancient battles and forgotten alliances, and of her kind standing beside humans not as enemies, but as equals, fighting side by side against machines that devoured life. The voice then faded, and the sky cracked with thunder as something moved in the fog below, something massive, something breathing, something alive. The platform shook, and Kai pulled Lyra back as the pillar split open, revealing a small orb made of light and shadow, and as it floated toward Lyra, it stopped in front of her chest and then sank into her skin without pain, without resistance, and her eyes glowed for a moment like twin stars before returning to normal. A gift or a curse, neither of them knew. The bridge behind them shattered as the beast below roared, and the platform began to sink slowly into the fog, and Kai grabbed Lyra and ran toward the edge where another path appeared, this one made of stone and wrapped in flame. They jumped onto the new path as the platform vanished behind them, and the fog boiled with movement, and from it rose a beast like nothing either had ever seen, with wings of bone and eyes of fire and a body made of metal and flesh. The golden garden stretched wide around them, with trees that shimmered like stars, and grass that hummed with quiet music, and rivers that flowed through the air like soft ribbons of silk. And Kai sat beneath one of the glowing trees, his breath slow, his eyes distant, as Lyra rested beside him, with the warmth of the orb still pulsing gently in her chest. They had escaped the beast and crossed the burning sky path and survived the whispering mountain, and now, for the first time, the air around them felt calm and soft, like the beginning of a forgotten dream, and yet the silence held something more, something deeper, something hidden beneath the beauty. Lyra stood slowly and walked toward a small pool that floated between two giant flowers, and as she leaned over the edge, she saw not her reflection, but a memory glowing on the water's surface. A vision of her people running through burning forests, chased by machines and fire, and behind them stood humans, some fighting with them, some watching from ships above with cold, unreadable eyes. She turned to Kai, her voice trembling and her hands clenched as she asked the question that had burned inside her since the first moment she saw him. Why did your kind destroy mine? Kai stood and walked to the pool and looked down at the images and then at her, and his eyes were not angry but full of something heavy, like sorrow and regret, and he pulled a small chip from his belt and placed it into a glowing stone near the pool, and the garden shifted around them. Now they stood in a different memory, one of Kai, as a child walking through ruined cities where machines walked. Like gods and human leaders argued over screens and maps, and behind them, cages filled with Lyra's kind, silent and scared and waiting for orders they could not understand. Kai pointed at one of the leaders and shook his head slowly, and then pointed at a small group of humans, hiding in the shadows, helping the captured one's escape and giving food and healing and hope. And then he touched his chest and looked at her. Not all humans are the same. Lyra looked away, her heart torn between pain and understanding. And then she felt the orb in her chest stir as if urging her forward, and she stepped into the pool, and instead of sinking, she rose into the air, and the light wrapped around her like a soft wave. Kai watched as she floated above the garden, her body surrounded by glowing symbols and beams of energy, and then the garden itself began to change. The trees faded into glass, the rivers froze mid-air, and the sky turned silver. She saw everything. The beginning of her kind, born from light and soil, gifted with peace and balance, their voices tuned to the pulse of the planet, and the arrival of machines that mined stars and consumed forests, and then the first contact with humans, some curious, some afraid, and some hungry for power. She saw the war, the betrayal, the fire, and the last hope sealed in a crystal deep beneath the mountain, waiting for the one who could carry the light again. The orb had chosen her not because she was strong, but because she was the last of the line of memory keepers, born to protect the truth and pass it on to those who would heal what was broken. Lyra returned to the ground, her eyes filled with tears and her hands glowing faintly, and she walked to Kai and took his hand, and he felt the pulse of the orb spread through him, not burning, not heavy, just warm and steady. They sat together again beneath the tree, and the garden began to restore itself slowly, gently, as if breathing in time with them. And Kai opened a hidden panel on his wrist and showed her a blinking message from the stars, a call for help from other survivors, not just humans, not just her kind, but many voices lost and waiting for someone to bring the light. He asked her with a quiet glance if she was ready to answer the call, and she nodded without words, because now she understood that her journey was no longer just about escape or survival, but about connection and healing and something greater than both. Suddenly the garden trembled as a low hum filled the air, and the ground cracked slightly near the center, where a spiral of light began to rise and a staircase of crystal emerged, leading downward into the roots of the mountain. The final path. Kai picked up his bag and adjusted the strap and checked the device on his wrist one more time, while Lyra touched the crystal steps and felt a rush of images pour into her mind, showing gates and temples and locked chambers filled with voices and secrets, and one final guardian sleeping in the heart of the world. They looked at each other one last time before the descent, and in their eyes was no fear, only trust, only purpose, only the unspoken bond that had grown through fire and storm and silence. With slow steps they walked down into the light, leaving behind the garden that had shown them truth, and stepping into the unknown, where answers waited and where destiny called them forward into the deep. The staircase of crystal spiraled deep into the mountain, carrying Kai and Lyra through walls of light and echoes of old songs that pulsed with every step. and the air grew warmer with a soft hum that wrapped around them like a voice without form speaking in a language they did not know but somehow still understood. As they moved downward, the path changed from crystal to stone, covered in vines that glowed faintly and whispered memories through their roots, and Lyra reached out her hand to touch one of the vines and felt a pulse move through her fingers, showing her glimpses of others who had once walked this path long before the war, long before the machines, long before the silence. They reached a wide chamber carved into the heart of the mountain where the walls curved like the inside of a living creature, and in the center stood a great sphere floating above a stone pedestal, glowing with gold and green and red lights swirling together like storm and fire. And Hopekai stepped closer, his eyes locked on the sphere, while Lyra stood beside him, her hand over her chest, where the orb inside her had begun to glow brighter than ever, pulsing with urgency, with rhythm. With life around the chamber sat statues of beings from every world they had seen in the visions, carved in positions of peace with palms open and heads bowed, and between them flowed streams of light that led directly into the heart of the sphere. The chamber was alive, the mountain was alive, and now it waited for them to decide. Kai raised his wrist device, and it blinked rapidly with red light, showing a signal sent from the sky, a warning that the machines had returned and were descending toward the valley with fire and metal and silence, and that this chamber would not remain hidden. For long. Lyra stepped forward, and the orb inside her lifted from her chest and hovered in the air, between them, spinning faster and faster as lines of ancient symbols began to rise from the floor like floating script, wrapping around her arms and face, and then around Kai as well. The great sphere reacted and opened slowly, revealing a hollow space filled with floating fragments of memory and sound, and inside it they saw faces, voices, planets burning, and stars healing, and something deeper, something older than light or shadow, a seed of balance that had been waiting to be awakened. The orb moved into the center and connected with the sphere, causing the chamber to shake and the statues to glow and a voice to rise, not from the walls, but from inside them both. Calm, ancient, kind, powerful, it spoke of choice, of unity or separation, of healing or hiding, of courage or fear. It told them they could take the light and run, hide it somewhere beyond the stars, and live in peace until the end of time, safe but alone while others suffered and broke and burned, or they could release it, let the light spread through every corner of space and time, wake the guardians of old, heal the wounds of war, risk the wrath of machines, and bring fire to the frozen hearts of those who had forgotten how to feel. Kai looked at Lyra, and Lyra looked at Kai, and in their eyes were the same answer without need for words, because they had seen death and fear and fire and lies, and they had seen kindness and truth and sacrifice and something stronger than anything else. Trust. Lyra stepped into the circle of light and raised her hands, and Kai placed his hands over hers, and together they whispered the only word they both knew in both their tongues, a word that echoed through the chamber and through the mountain and through the stars. Yes, the sphere pulsed once, then again, then exploded in light, without sound, sending waves through the stone and through the sky and through the machines that now hovered above the valley, freezing them in place and filling them with echoes they did not understand but could not ignore. The mountain split open, revealing its heart to the sky, and the golden garden rose into the clouds, carried by beams of light, and from it flew hundreds of seeds like stars shooting across the world, landing in cities and ruins and forests and oceans, and with each seed came a memory, a truth, a chance. Kai and Lyra stood in the center of it all as the light wrapped around them, not burning, not fading, but changing, lifting them into the sky where stars bowed and planets turned and time held its breath. They had not just saved each other, they had reminded the universe of what it had forgotten, the value of connection, strength of difference, the beauty of choice. When the light faded, they stood again on solid ground, but not where they began, not in the forest or the cave or the mountain, but in a field under a sky that was no longer green or black, but blue, with a rising sun and birds singing the first songs of a new day. All around them stood others, alien and human, machine and child, each looking at each other not as enemies but as beings with stories and scars and songs. Lyra looked at Kai, and Kai smiled, and neither needed to say anything more because the journey was over, but the story was just beginning.